Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We are continuing our discussion of the New England colonies. In the previous lecture, we talked about the Chesapeake settlement, and in this lecture, we're going to begin talking about the New England colonies. So, between roughly 1600 and 1670, we see four different regions of English settlement. They will be different in their social and political structures, their economies, their leaders, and their objectives and outcomes. In the previous lectures, we talked about the Chesapeake colonies, focused on Jamestown. And in this lecture, we're going to be focusing on the New England colonies. And then in upcoming lectures, we're going to be talking about the Middle colonies, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, in that region, and then later the Deep South colonies, the Carolinas and Georgia. The first English settlement in New England was established by the Pilgrims in 1620. The Pilgrims were a group of Puritan separatists. They wanted to separate from the Anglican Church and start a new church. They were persecuted in England and thus wanted to establish this new safe haven in what becomes New England. In 1620, led by William Bradford, they secured a patent to join the Virginia Company. 101 men, women, and children sailed on the Mayflower, originally intended to reach Virginia, but they were caught in a storm and ended up being swept to what is known today as Cape Cod in modern-day Massachusetts. William Bradford, their leader, wrote, "Being thus arrived at safe harbor, and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean." So they set up their colony there and settled in for a harsh winter. Now, recognizing that they were not going to be part of the Virginia colony, they established their own form of government, writing a new political document called the Mayflower Compact, which read in part that its signers solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civic body politic for our ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid. In essence, they agree to establish a government that will work for the betterment of the whole rather than a fiercely individualistic society. And we're going to see this really throughout New England. Now, life for the Pilgrims was very difficult, especially over that first year. More than half their number perished. But with the assistance of local Indians, chief among them Squanto, they were able to learn some of the Native American techniques of agriculture, and they were able to survive. The story of the Pilgrims is a familiar one, but the Pilgrims were always a small minority in New England compared to the major group to settle there, the Puritans. So let's talk a little bit about who the Puritans were. They were a very literate group, as I'm going to discuss in just a minute, meaning that they left extensive written records which historians love and have pored over and over again over the years. Still, the Puritans are sometimes misunderstood, and the description of the famous writer H.L. Mencken, who described Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy, seems like an apt description. So who were the Puritans? Well, we can summarize it by saying they were Congregationalist, bibliocentric Calvinists, which sounds like a very complicated phrase, but let's break it down. The Congregationalist, meaning that they gathered in congregations, they gathered in small self-governing churches. This is also going to contribute to the small town nature of New England, which I'll also discuss more in a bit. Bibliocentric, meaning that the Bible was the center of their worship. The Bible contained all wisdom, and further, they believed that each individual should read the scripture on their own, which is also going to contribute to their very high rate of literacy and education. And Calvinist, which is a little bit more complicated, but essentially John Calvin believed in predestination. which we'll go over more in just a moment. In 1629, King Charles I granted a patent of settlement to a group of merchants and Puritans which would settle in New England. The leader of this group was John Winthrop, and it turned out that he developed this colony primarily as a safe haven for the persecuted Puritans that we talked about earlier. John Winthrop also made a famous description of this new colony, describing it as a city on a hill. Winthrop said, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." This really launches an idea that I mentioned in my very first lecture that applies to pretty much all of American history, that we view ourselves as unique, we perceive the eyes of the world upon us, everyone is watching, and thus we have kind of a special place in the world order. Now let's come back to this idea of predestination. I suppose that some of us would feel like if our fate was predetermined, if there are a select few of us who are destined to make it to heaven, which is essentially what the Calvinists believed, then our attitude might be, well, whatever, I can do whatever I want, and my fate is predetermined anyway, so if I make it to heaven or go to hell, it doesn't matter what I do. The Puritans didn't think that way, however, which is a little bit surprising perhaps. In their view, the way one acted here on earth was a signal as to whether they were one of the elect, one of the chosen who would make it to heaven. So, if we are honest, industrious, hard-working, and successful here on earth, that could be a sign that we are among the chosen. If, on the other hand, we are lazy or sinful, then we are probably damned. And so, in a kind of odd and perhaps unexpected way, their belief in predestination led most Puritans to be very hard-working. This is the famous Puritan work ethic. They were generally successful in business, and their economy revolved around a variety of small businesses like cobblers and printers, metalsmiths, and clockmakers. But they were a very hard-working group. The Puritans sought to create a religious commonwealth. Their society revolved around small towns and cities rather than spread out farms and plantations, and this also relates to the Congregationalist nature of their group, which I mentioned a moment ago. They gathered with their church group, and in order to do that, you had to live fairly close to each other in towns and cities. While the Chesapeake, as I described previously, was characterized by violence and chaos, the word of the day in New England was order. People lived close to one another, they kept an eye on each other, and they followed a strict code of Puritan ethics. And anyone who stepped outside of that code and misbehaved in some way was potentially treated with extreme cruelty. They could be beaten, their ears could be cropped, their tongue pierced, or they might even be banished from the colony altogether, which we'll talk about a few examples of this later on. In terms of government, all church members were involved in their society in some way, and all men were given the right to vote early on, although that's not a perfect equation, and you can read more about that in some of your course readings. But they have a much more sort of democratically based society than some of the other regions we're going to talk about. There also is a very low poverty rate in New England compared to some other regions. Again, we can attribute this to their hardworking, industrious nature and the variety of kind of trades and businesses that flourish. And they are also extremely literate when compared with some of the other regions. And again, I've already mentioned one of the main reasons for this is their emphasis on reading the Bible and each individual being able to read the Bible for him or herself. So we might summarize this preliminary kind of contrast between the Chesapeake region and Virginia with the New England region focused around the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Puritan New England. And one of the things that you see here is that the life expectancy on the whole in Virginia is much, much shorter than what we see in New England. So here we see Massachusetts Bay, and here we have Plymouth. In both cases, life expectancy was considerably longer for those living in New England than those living in the Chesapeake. However, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, for those who did manage to survive in the Chesapeake, there was perhaps greater opportunity to accumulate wealth. So that's something you might have to sort out in your own mind. Would it be better to have this very risky sort of low chance of surviving, but if you do survive, you could become very wealthy? Or to live in a very rigid, orderly society in New England where you might not rise to great ranks of wealth, but you're more likely to have a very long life. Well, you can think about that dilemma for yourselves, and in the next couple of lectures we will talk about the other regions of English settlement in the Americas.